Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal, of course, is to show that everything is figure-outable. And today's guest expert is Joseph Michelli. Joseph is an internationally sought-after speaker, author, organizational consultant. He is the author of numerous books, national bestsellers, including The Starbucks Experience, The New Gold Standard, and the New York Times #1 bestseller, Prescription for Excellence. He was named as one of the top 10 thought leaders in consumer service, customer service by global gurus, and his new book, The Airbnb Way, 5 leadership lessons for igniting growth through loyalty, community, and belonging. Joseph, it's so great to have you on the podcast. How are you today?
I am so excited to be with you, Jake. I'm great. Thanks. Let's get it going.
Yeah, I wish that we had a couple hours because I think each one of your books deserves a fair deep dive. But for this episode, we're going to dive in mostly to the Airbnb way. But before we do that, give us a little background on who you are and how you came to be such a prolific author.
I'm such a lucky guy. I was adopted into a family in a very small town in Colorado and was really encouraged to do what I could do to make a better world out there. And somehow or another, I've gotten so many great breaks and worked with so many wonderful leaders. And through the journey of consulting, I would tell stories of some of the brands that I've worked with consultatively. And it's worked out for me. So I continue to consult, speak, and write.
Yeah. And so when you first, let's say, got out of your formal education period, did you then go right into consulting, like with a big house, or did you start out on your own? How did you get into consulting?
No, I think probably my journey isn't all that different than you. We finished our formal education, your case, law school and business school, and then worked for someone, right? So I think you were working for the Boy Scouts of America and the National Foundation. I was working in healthcare for a number of years, and it took me a while to say, okay, enough of all this security. Let's follow our dream and enter into the world of being an independent consultant.
Yeah, and so then you started working with some of these companies and you got leadership lessons, you got ideas from working with them, and then those translated into a book. But we kind of make that sound like it's a simple process. I started consulting and then I wrote a book. But writing a book is very difficult. So tell me about your very first book and how you disciplined yourself to sit down and really pull out those nuggets of truth that you learned throughout your experience.
Well, I think some of it is facing the conversation in your head that says you are not an author. Thoreau is an author. You are just, this person who barely can put sentences together. So for me, it was kind of getting through that internal conversation and my self-identity that I'm not an author, and really admitting that if I've learned something worthwhile from these experiences, I should teach it. It's part of the obligation that I have in the world. So for me, I focused on teaching what I learned, and just that journey was a bit clunky. I mean, it wasn't as though, publishers knocked at my door and said, hey, will you please write a book about your experiences? But what was interesting is one of the brands that I consulted for and worked with over the years is the Pike Place Fish Market in Seattle, Washington. And they had just had a huge book and a huge training going on called Fish. And, thanks to Ken Blanchard and his people really making this little fish market known, there was a lot of inquiry into tell us more, which I know is a favorite of yours. Tell us more how they did that. And so I was part of how they did that. So there was an appetite for me to share a story. So the publisher that had done Fish, Hyperion, was interested in us writing a book from the owner's perspective. And so I co-wrote a book with the owner of the Pike Place Fish Market. And from there, things just went kind of crazy. It really was amazing how things started to open up.
What I often say is, when one door opens or when one door closes, another opens, but you don't know how long you're going to be walking down the hallway, and you don't know what kind of experiences that you're going to have in between. And so you're writing about Pike's Place, or you're joined up with the people who did that Fish book. Were you up in the Seattle area? Is that how you got involved with Starbucks, or where were you located?
Well, the Starbucks thing came straight out of the Pike Place Fish Market. So, the original Starbucks store is about 1,000 yards down from the Pike Place Fish Market. So I write this book with Johnny Yokoyama, who's really a father mentor kind of guy to me, and who really, I think, created a transformative experience around a little fish market there in Seattle. But Starbucks, which was just a stone's throw away from the original Starbucks store, just stone's throw away from the fish market, it opened up the door to doing some things with Starbucks and ultimately writing my first book about Starbucks. I've written two about them. And really, then you get to meet people like Howard Schultz, and then that just opens up doors after doors. And I love your point about closing and opening of doors, because I think it's a lot about being ready. It's that joinder of readiness and opportunity that makes for great leadership. And for me, I guess I was ready. I didn't know that I was ready, but certainly the doors opened and I walked in. So something happened.
Yeah, and we often talk about that, ideas are a dime a dozen. Everybody has ideas. Everybody who's taken a shower or driven a car has had an idea about how to make the world a better place, or about a product that the world needs, or about something that they could change. But it's really the execution on those ideas that makes the difference. And here we're talking to an author who has a number of books, New York Times bestseller. You're doing so much. How did you go from the idea stage, which a lot of us and a lot of listeners to this podcast are in right now, to the execution stage, which really made the difference in your life and your career?
Well, I think I failed forward, and I think that is a key component here. It's a willingness to be humble and to fail, right? I think there's a lot of people out there who are very defensive, who want to know it before they know it, who are afraid because they have like this perfection myth inside of their head that they have to be perfect before they initiate action. All of that goes on, and for me, it really somehow is probably just parenting. I got lucky with parents, but I think I was very willing to say, I don't know this stuff. I want to ask a lot of questions. And the more questions I asked, the more interesting information I got from people. And then the more I told the stories of the people who were giving me the answers, the more things worked out for me. So it's probably just stupidity and persistence at some level, and a willingness to embarrass myself in the hopes that someday maybe what I did wasn't going to be quite as embarrassing.
And I think this is a huge lesson for the listeners to pull out of this, and that is you just got to start moving forward. You just got to act. I often say that that imperfect action beats inaction every time. And so just start moving forward. So one of the things that you did was you started writing about these big companies, but now I want to transition a little bit and talk about this new company, this new book, this brand new book that just came out, and that's the Airbnb Way, 5 leadership lessons for igniting growth through loyalty, community, and belonging. And I want to jump into the 5 leadership lessons, but I want to start out by saying a couple of things. Number one, unlike many of the listeners of this podcast, have a very strong experience with Airbnb. As I mentioned before we started recording, I've spent over 300 nights in one single year living in Airbnbs in 10 different countries. So I'm very familiar with the experience. But maybe some of our listeners haven't had an experience with Airbnb, or they tried it out once or twice, maybe on a quick vacation. So give us a little background of why Airbnb got interesting to you, why you got interested in Airbnb to discuss it for this book.
So in 2008, I was writing about the RitzCarlton Hotel Company, and I'm in a room with the senior leadership of the RitzCarlton. We're in Chevy Chase, Maryland. We're talking about issues like this. Well, the traveler's changing. What should we be doing? We have one of the most elevated customer experiences in the industry, but should we be allowing guests to drink beer out of a bottle? I mean, that's literally where we were. So there was this refined service offering. There was this debate going on about our traditional customers versus new millennial wealthy people traveling who wanted to drink their beer at a bottle. So I'm having those discussions in 2008. Same time in San Francisco, there's these 2 guys trying to make rent on their apartment. And while they're doing that, they're trying to figure out how do we market this little space in our apartment so we don't lose it. And they know there's a design conference coming to San Francisco. They're design students. They have a friend help them with a rudimentary website. Lo and behold, they're able to rent out that room during the conference for $80 a night, 3 air mattresses waitresses were in the room. So they made $240. They gave the people who went into that room breakfast. So there was air mattress, B&B, air mattress, and the breakfast was uncooked Pop-Tarts. So then let's advance a course of 11 years now. Now Airbnb is valued at $38 billion. They'll go public next year. And the Ritz-Carlton Hotel Company, which is a part of the Marriott Company, is valued approximately $42 billion. And the Marriott has a ton of that wealth in their physical assets. Airbnb owns virtually nothing except a web platform. So for me, this is the 21st century company. It's what hospitality looks like in this era compared to what it looked like in 2008. And it was time for me to go to the other side of the equation and start talking about a sharing economy and what does it take to create emotionally engaging, relatable experiences with a combination of technology and human touch.
And I want to take you back to the experience that you were having at the Ritz-Carlton and ask you maybe some distinguishing questions about that, comparing it to something like a Blockbuster or a Kodak film. So any of us who have been through business school have gone through the case studies, right? Of Blockbuster was unwilling to make an adjustment and now they no longer exists. We got the same thing with Kodak, right? They were the first to have the digital camera. They decided to kind of bury it. And now, of course, Kodak is gone. But I want to distinguish that a little bit from the experience at the Ritz-Carlton, because when you guys were sitting there and talking about, the changing environment, the changing consumer, it's a little bit different in that I believe that the Ritz-Carlton and hotels themselves still have a niche that they play, a role that they play. And while Airbnb may have came in to disrupt it and to change it a little bit, there's still a place for both of them. What do you think about that?
Oh, there's definitely a place for both of them. I think this is a leadership lesson of untold importance, though. So there's a law in business called the Martech's law. It's not studied much, but it's worthwhile. So let me just kind of take you. I think Ritz-Carlton was on an incremental journey of improvement. It knew that it was needing to still remain relevant to its traditional traveler as well as to a new emerging traveler, but it was still going to be a big play for vacation travelers on an elevated high-end experience, along with business travelers who wanted an elevated experience. So, but incrementally, they were saying, we've got to improve. We've got to be better today than we were yesterday. Great. Now, what Airbnb is a very different play. They were taking what I would consider an exponential leap, and they were following consumers at a deeper level, right? So they were saying, how are consumers changing in more radical underlying drivers? And what they were looking at is that, there's a whole group of people who don't want sameness, who don't want to travel every single experience exactly the same in a 350 square foot room that looks like the 350 square foot room in some other city that I just stayed in the night before. So they knew that lack of desire for sameness and a desire to get off the grid and have, to travel local was something that was really big. They also noticed that lots of consumers were not so interested in kind of the environmental impact of washing towels every night and, just the impact of traveling to the center of a town to have an experience instead of being able to, to go right where I want to stay. So the key message I'm saying here is that sharing was becoming bigger, reuse was becoming bigger, and so was this notion of traveling differently. And so this exponential difference and the need to be able to really make it all easy using mobile technology, because mobile technology has changed the consumer behavior dramatically. The exponential difference of consumer behavior versus the incremental improvement of the brand is what Martech would call the disruption gap. And so Airbnb shoots the disruption gap, and they follow the exponential behavior of the consumer as opposed to the incremental trends of brands like Ritz-Carlton. Back to your point, there's a world that exists for both. And what you'll see is the Marriott company initially would ignore something like Airbnb as irrelevant, small market, niche. But over time, now the Marriott company is trying to get into the home sharing business and add it to its portfolio. So, yeah, I think it's one of those cases where they mock you and then they mimic you, right? And so clearly there's something for everyone. And I stay a lot in hotels. Trust me, I really do, particularly when I have a presentation the next morning and I want to make sure, I know what's going to happen the night before.
You make a great point. I did a lot of traveling throughout my career, and I would often joke that people would say, "Hey, you've got Hawaii in your territory. Isn't that terrific to be able to go to Hawaii?" And I say the inside of a Marriott in Honolulu looks exactly like the inside of the Marriott in Pocatello. But I like the consistency. I like the fact that if I'm doing a presentation, that I don't have to worry about anything. Everything's taken care of, and I know what to expect. My brain doesn't have to think. But when I'm traveling for leisure, when I'm traveling with my family, when I'm trying to really get to know the town or the city, I love the uniqueness. Now, I'm going to bring you back to one point that you said, and it's actually in your book, and it's a great point, and that is this idea of technology as a disruptor. And you actually say in your book that technology is not really a disruptor. And I want to read just a portion and then have you teach us a little bit from this. So you say that Amazon didn't kill the retail industry. They did it to themselves. The retail industry did it to itself with bad customer service. Or Netflix didn't kill Blockbuster. Blockbuster did it to themselves. Uber didn't kill taxis. Taxis did it to themselves. Apple in the music industry. We're talking about Airbnb in the hotel industry. And then you say this: technology by itself is not the real disruptor. Being non-customer centric is the biggest threat to any business. And I want to have you teach on that for just a minute.
Sure. And those insights were really initially crafted by Alberto Brea, and I want to make sure he gets credit for it. So I think that the point is failures on the part of the brand to deliver what customers need is what causes them to get beaten in the marketplace. Technology often is the tool that enables customers to get what they need more efficiently. I was in front of, just recently, I got a picture in front of the last Blockbuster. It's in Bend, Oregon, in case anybody wants a photo op and a selfie shot.
And that's about all they do there.
That's all they got, right? And the brand is gone. But I stayed in line. I paid the late fees. I gave them bad profit. Over and over again, they made money and I got limited value. And to me, that's what creates these disruptions. I want value for my money. And if you keep forcing me to play your game in a way that reduces the overall experience of value, I am just waiting for a coupon from a competitor to pull me over. And that's really, I think, what the disruption's a lot about, is that we as consumers say, enough already. I want a divorce. I do not want to deal with a brand that has that little regard for who I am and what I want.
Now, that's easy for us to look back on companies like Kodak and companies like Blockbuster and say, well, they made a bad decision and they missed an opportunity. But it's just as easy that they could have, that there's many examples of companies who have actually stayed with their business model or stayed with what's working and actually found success through that. And I think that through, our study, it's interesting that, we can pull out examples, on this end of people who have made adjustments, people on this end who have stayed true to what's really working for them. And so, as we talk about being a leader and we're sitting in that RitzCarlton room, or we're sitting in our own conference room, and we're talking about the future of our business and what our customers are looking for, how do we not make the mistake of getting out too early, or how do we avoid the mistake of missing the opportunity as it comes?
Well, and I think this is the art of leadership, right? This is so much the dance of strategic planning. But I can tell you that frequently what happens, I have a friend who's a business professor who says, there will be a company that will make an incredible hamburger and an incredible milkshake, and they will win the market, and then they'll start getting into fish and chips and all kinds of other things, and then they'll lose their audience because they didn't stay with the one that brought them. But what often happens is you can make it forever with a great hamburger and great milkshake if you continue to contemporize how you deliver that relationship to the customer in the marketplace. So let's look at Starbucks really quickly, because it's a company I've studied a lot. Right now, Starbucks is test marketing in New York City stores that only allow for you to go in and pick up a pre-ordered drink. So you're using your mobile technology to order and pay, and you walk in and you grab your drink. There is no ability to order in line, stand in the store, do any of that. They haven't changed the coffee. What they've changed is the environment and the delivery system in a way that's more relevant to many consumers who are preferring to just mobile order, mobile pickup. I think that's the challenge, is constantly testing and learning if you can get greater relevance to consumer needs with the products that you have, or if you have to start changing your product mix on behalf of your customers.
Your Starbucks example is really interesting, and it'll be great to kind of follow how that experiment works over time, because to me that sounds like we're just creating coffee vending machines where I can just go put my quarters in, get a cup of coffee and leave. And I think Starbucks, and even the title of your book, is more about the experience than it is really the coffee. I mean, there's coffee everywhere.
But I just would say the person who wants to go into that particular environment wants convenience as the key driver, but they don't want an absence of people, because if so, they would go to the coffee robots, and there are many of them out there. What they'll want is a human to hand them the coffee and say, thank you, Jake, I really appreciate you coming in today, and give you that coffee with that human warmth. It's still super efficient. But it still allows for that moment of human interaction, which I think we're going to still crave. I mean, maybe the coffee robots will win in the end, and if so, probably all of us have to really wonder if we're going to have any careers. But I still think there'll be a place for people to say thank you, for people to be excited about your arrival. And that gets really to the Airbnb message around belonging. I mean, one of the things that makes this brand so amazing is that 90% of it happens online, right? Airbnb is all about a marketplace. But what they're trying to do is encourage the person who might touch another person to do that with incredible, excited, human warmth. And that sometimes happens by handing a key. Sometimes it's just on the web, having a brief conversation interaction, telling you how to get the code to get in your Airbnb. But it still should be human, leveraging the uniqueness of the human enabled by the technology.
And a real quick story about that human experience. We flew into Prague, Czech Republic, and our flight was delayed, and they left my bag in Moscow. And so we get in about 2 a.m. We had flown from Bangkok, Thailand, so we were in shorts, t-shirts, flip-flops. It was December 15th, and the temperature was like 8 degrees. There was 5 of us, my 3 kids, my wife, and I. And I remember getting to our Airbnb, and the lady who owned it was there at 2 a.m. waiting for us to open the door and to show us where the beds were. And of course, she didn't stay long. She just kind of said, hey, here's the beds, here's the keys, here's everything. But it was that human experience. And we ended up staying there for 90 days. I mean, we kept renewing our lease or our rental just because she was such an amazing person. And of course, her place was great. So as we look at the Airbnb way, really, you talk about 5 leadership lessons that you pulled out of your experience, and we don't have time to dive into them, and that's why we have the book. I mean, they can go pick up a copy of the book, and they can learn about them. But I want to unpack just one of them in the time that we have here. So in the book, you talk about, you have it separated in parts. And each part is unique. You go through the 5 parts. One is belonging, one is trust, so on through the book. Tell us how you decided on separating the book into a couple of chapters per part to go along with these 5 leadership lessons.
So it's kind of a couplet book, right? So if I do something on belonging, I'm talking about how do the leaders at Airbnb try to create belonging for their own teams? How do they have their teams help create belonging out into the host community? That's one chapter. And then the next chapter will be, how do those hosts create belonging for guests? How did that lady do those things and create a sense of belonging for your family? And the same with trust. What is Airbnb doing trying to create trust on the platform? And then the next chapter would be, how is it that hosts would create trust on behalf of guests? What do they do to build a trust relationship? And how are, reputation systems created by Airbnb to support the trust we have in what we're going to get? So clearly that the book is designed to try to take it at the very senior leadership level within the Airbnb community, but then take it to the hosts, because these hosts are leaders and entrepreneurs and solopreneurs. And so how did they take those concepts that Airbnb is trying to communicate through their brand and live them into the life of the guest?
One final question for you that kind of goes along with that. By the way, I think that is just a tremendous way to write the book, because I think it appeals to, both sides of what we're interested in. We're interested in the business side, how the company is strategically trying to grow and move forward. But we're also interested in the stories. We want to know how those business ideas that are created in a boardroom actually translate into the real world and into our experience. And a lot of your readers are going to be consumers of Airbnb, not necessarily business leaders that are running around and trying to do something similar in their business. So on that same idea, I want to ask you, you've worked with some huge brands. You've worked with RitzCarlton. You've worked with Zappos. You've worked with Starbucks. You've written about these companies. You've gotten really in-depth knowledge about them. Now you're writing about Airbnb. How does Airbnb stack up against some of these other companies that we've heard so much about?
Well, I think they're open-minded. So your message about leading with open-mindedness and approachability, I mean, these guys are kind of freaky, crazy, open-minded leaders. They study Carol Dweck's work on open mindset. They study some of these other people. I mean, literally, Tony Hsieh, who I worked with over at Zappos, is a mentor to the Airbnb folks, right? So these guys are constantly looking at and benchmarking the best of the best. And I think they're a little more nimble than some of these other leaders and many of these other brands because they're younger and they have, the more equity you get in a brand, the slower you move, I think. Realistically, they're a little bit more nimble than some of the others. But other than that, they are sponges and they're taking the best of all those other leadership brands that I've worked with.
Yeah, and I think that could be an additional podcast episode, this idea of open-mindedness and mentorship and how that plays into growth and success. And you talk about how, someone like Tony Hsieh is going to hang out with the Airbnb people to really build that relationship, learn from each other, take the mistakes that they've made and try to avoid them. And as I think about like the kind of society that we're getting into now, I have young kids that play sports. And sports, when I was a kid, it was like you played soccer in the fall or football in the fall, and then you play baseball, and then you play football, soccer. You'd kind of rotate amongst the sports. Everybody would play everything. Nowadays, these kids are basically spending the entire year doing baseball or doing football. And we're really becoming specialized. And that's just one example in sports. But you look at education, you have schools where you can go to now as young people and study just like engineering or STEM topics all the way through and really setting us up to be really specialized individuals. And I think that that's translating into what these companies are doing. You're talking about, Ritz-Carlton maybe back in the 70s was sitting around the boardroom having a different conversation than they are in 2019. And it's companies like Airbnb that's changing the mindset of leadership within the boardrooms because they're saying, look, we have to find a way that even though we're big, we have to find a way to be nimble. And so tell me how your experience has been with that.
I think one of the things is that the Airbnb guys were pretty much specialists in design and technology. So they would go out and they'd find the guru, the mentor in a field. And so someone like Chip Conley, who is the king of hospitality, he has Joie de Vivre hotels in San Francisco. He came over and he brought his expertise in hospitality and became an internal consultant, coach, leader. And, if you know Chip's work, he's written Peak, how, businesses get their mojo from Maslow. So a lot of that notion of belonging comes from a Maslowian concept that says, we've got basic needs and then higher level needs. And among the higher level needs is belonging. We need to know we belong. And so they would bring these experts in. And now he's written a book called Modern Elder. So they bring in these modern elders, if you will, to help them understand areas where they're deficient because their expertise had been in design or in technology.
Yeah, I love this conversation, Joseph. It's been absolutely amazing to dive into kind of these leadership lessons that you've pulled out of your experiences and then try to start thinking about how we can apply them in our own businesses, in our own environments. Alas, though, we're running a little bit short on time, and it's time now to switch over to our Learning from Leaders topic, ask you a few questions about what's going on in your study and in your life. How does that sound?
Great. Let's do it.
All right. First question. Our book currently on your Kindle or bedside table, what are you currently reading?
Every few years, I read the same book. It's Man's Search for Meaning. It's on my bookshelf right now, right next to my table. So yeah, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl always inspires me to know what humans are capable of doing in the face of adversity.
It's interesting. I think that sometimes in life, the universe swings opportunity our way. I think the universe has its own choreography. And just 2 days ago, I was having a conversation with my 14-year-old, and she had picked up a copy of The Happiness Advantage, which is a great book. Yeah, love the book as well. She was a little disappointed being not a business-minded person, and she was looking for a book that told her how to be happy or how to have happiness in the face of challenge. And I said, if that's what you're looking for, you got to pick up Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. I said, it's required reading if you want to understand how to look at adversity and kind of power through it with your mindset. So I love that book recommendation. Our second question, your leadership superpower.
Oh, I think it's of the ones you've identified, it's adaptability. I think if you work with people, you better be adaptable, and that is my strength. And I don't assume that any path is the right path. I'm constantly looking for ways to meet the needs of others by bending our paths.
I love it. And I share that one myself. That's my leadership superpower, adaptability as well. How about a motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra, something that you live by?
Yeah, if only I could have ever met this person. Mother Teresa once said, "It's not how much we give, it's how much love we put into giving." So it's not just quantity of giving, it's that emotional act that supports the giving.
And I think from a business perspective, I mean, so much that she taught has so many is relevant in so many different areas. But from a business perspective, it's not the actions that you're doing. It's the passion that you put into it. It's the desire to grow and learn. And I often say, hire for character, hire for passion, hire for person, and then train for skill.
Yep. And as particularly also hire for somebody who wants to learn, because they're going to need to have that if you're going to train for skill. So yeah.
Yeah, and imagine, I mean, in 5 years, the jobs that we're thinking about today aren't even going to exist. I tell my kids not to worry about the specific job, but to look at the things that they're interested in, because they're going to have to adapt and evolve. I mean, 10 years ago, who would have thought Airbnb, Uber, who would have thought that all of these opportunities for, online mobile usage would happen? And then today, it's really driving our economy.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm a certified customer experience professional, among other things. There wasn't even a title called customer experience when I started in my career. And here I am, certified in it. So, you never know what it's going to turn out to be.
Yeah, I said the same thing about podcasting, right? In 1995, when I was a DJ on the radio, I would have never known that I could just set this up in my home and do it myself and not even have to play music.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're worried about ratings because I was in radio as well.
All right, our final question then is the book that you most often gift or refer to friends, family, and colleagues.
Oh, wow. There's so many books that I give to colleagues that I'm really probably not a good person, because it seems like my friends kind of tell me they don't need any more books because I send them all. But, I think most of the time when I am sending books, it's something that inspires me. I'm just, I'm at a loss for the answer to that, because I send out books all the time. I'd have to look over at my bookshelf. Recently, I sent All In, which is an interesting book. Arlene Dickinson, she's one of the sharks up in Canada in the Shark Tank world. But for my entrepreneur friends, I send them All In, because it just speaks to the heart of a true entrepreneur, that we're all in, that our lives are consumed by what we do, and that it's a noble art of trying to create value for others.
Well, excellent. I love that recommendation. And also the discussion about, like, for different situations and different scenarios and different friends, family, and colleagues, there are different books and there's different timing for different books. And this is my favorite this week, but next week it may be something completely different. So, Joseph, you've been a tremendous guest on the show. Before we let you go, tell us, how can we pick up the Airbnb Way? How can we find out more about you and look at some of your other books?
So go to airbnbway.com, just airbnbway.com. A couple of things will happen there. You'll have a link to go to CEO Read, which is now called Porchlight. You can get a discount on the book through that link.
Very cool. We'll link all of that up on the show notes for this episode. Joseph, this is a fascinating concept. Thank you for coming on and being this week's Modern Leadership guest expert.
Hey, thanks for what you're doing for leadership, Jake.
All right, my friends, I could have gone all day. I tell you, I eat this stuff up. I love to talk to business leaders that are really looking in, like real deep dive, pull back the curtain. Let's see what the inside of these companies, what makes them tick, what makes them run, and how are they doing things? And it's all just experiment. They don't know that this is going to work. They go out and they try it. Of course, they try to do test studies and they try to look at the opportunity and they try to predict where society and the customer experience is going. But all in all, just like you and me, they're running a business. They're looking at the future and they're trying to make decisions based on limited knowledge, data-driven decisions. The more information that we can gather, the better our decisions are. And so my big takeaway from this episode, I love talking to Joseph about this open-mindedness and this need for mentorship. That these leaders, the Airbnb people, went out and sought wise elders, those people who could really help them to avoid the pitfalls. Hey, I tried it this way. It's not going to work because of this, this, and this. Making decisions and moving forward. Of course, everything that we talked about on this episode of the podcast, including a link to pick up the Airbnb Way and links to all of Joseph's books, can be found on jakeacarlson.com/ML157, episode 157. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. And of course, everything is figure outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.